I must say it's an absolute joy to be talking in front of people. For me, this is the first time for 18 months as well. I so hate looking at my avatar delayed when I'm trying to speak at a conference in the corner. I find that most off-putting. I'd much rather be looking at you. So thanks very much for the chance to have a chat. And thank you very much from the Academy for giving me a chance to tell my story, you might say. I too will give you the story of what has motivated me and why I have done what I've done, and I guess some ideas about the kind of motivations along the way. So what has motivated me? Well, really, you might say that my life has been a life dedicated to hearing. I've thought about hearing and what we don't know about hearing and how to solve it every day for the last 35 years, I would say. There wouldn't have been a day go by where this hasn't preoccupied my mind. And why is that? Well, I mean, hearing is, of course, important, you know, if you want to learn to speak. In other words, it's the essence of communication is hearing. And that's why some people, when asked and really pushed, would rather actually be blind than not hear, because with hearing, you can still communicate with human beings on an emotional level with greater ease. I mean, this may not be everyone's view, but it's certainly, from what I see as a person who sees people lose their hearing and get increasingly isolated, this really is a great joy and privilege to help people hear better so that they can communicate with everyone around them. You know, it's how we interact with people. It's how we learn at school. It is how we interact with our peers. So these are the things that hearing are to everyone, and it's fairly silent because no one really thinks about it until they lose their hearing. So this has also really become more important as I've got older, and something I would never have imagined really thinking about. But, you know, when people get old, they start to lose their hearing and they're already isolated, and not to be able to hear is a huge issue. In fact, the oldest person I've implanted is 98. She was recommended an implant at 91. And at 98, she said, you know, I'm still going, right? So, and I think of it's a bit like replacing someone's hip. Are you going to leave someone at 91 with a broken hip or so they can't move? No. So why would you want to isolate them socially? In fact, this lady had her 100th birthday on Channel 9, I think it was, with us. We threw her a party and the hospital wasn't interested until the cameras were coming, and then everyone was there, of course. But it was a great joy, absolute joy, just to have her experiences. And another experience that really was incredibly moving was the lady who I implanted late in her 80s, who her family sent me a card after she died about 4 years later. And what they said was it was just such an important thing for the family to communicate with her in her last days. So these are the things that motivate me. Anyway, how did I end up there? Well, this was really one of the defining moments in my life as a surgeon-scientist. The space race. At the time, I was about 8.5 when man landed on the moon. But the excitement around that, and for me as a young person, what really captured my imagination was not only the awe of it, the absolute splendor of someone leaving the planet to go and stand on the moon, but I could see that a whole nation was behind it. I had no idea of the politics. I'm actually glad I didn't, because from my perspective, you could sense it was a palpable excitement that was all around the world. It stopped everyone in their tracks. But a whole nation of the US had bought into that. And you could see that. So what I've learned was that there's no limit to what human beings can do if they are motivated by a greater goal. It's not just working together, it's the inspiration that really drives people together. And everyone gets caught up in the excitement. And it's that really focused my mind to say, I want to make a difference one day. But you do it by bringing people together around you. In fact, I wanted to be one of them, right? I wanted to be on the moon. And maybe one day, I'll get the chance. I've got 20 years or so of this kind of space tourism to go, but so maybe I'll make it. But that was really a defining motivator for my thinking and got me really interested in science from a very young age and gave me an understanding of what it meant to be in awe of something. And then this was probably the most important brush of history I've had. That young looking surgeon there on the left, the one on the right is my 21st birthday. This happened in the year of my 21st birthday, is Graham Clark. Now, I'm sure you all know that Graham Clark invented the cochlear implant. So I was a young medical student and one of my colleagues said, look, I'm doing this really interesting thing over at the Idea Hospital. I'm doing this thing called a Bachelor of Medical Science. It's only for the really bright people. Maybe not for you, but it's for the bright people. So anyway, so what happened was that I ended up walking over to the Idea Hospital, and within an hour, I'm sitting in front of Graham Clark, who's convincing me to do a Bachelor of Medical Science because it was science and I was really interested in science. I'd become so motivated by science as a younger person from the moon kind of thing. And I did a Bachelor of Medical Science the next year with Graham Clark. It happened to be the year that the first commercial cochlear implant was done. And I happened to be sitting there in the department watching the live stream. It's incredible what a privilege that was. But again, now I was part of a team that was totally focused. It was totally focused, not getting someone on the moon, but it was totally focused on getting someone to hear. We had 2 computers in the department. And when the first patients came in of the first commercial device, the 2 computers were entirely preoccupied with doing the tests on getting this person to hear. Everything else stopped. But, what I learned there was it's just as exciting to be part of a team that is doing something exceptional. And that really, really has stayed with me for the rest of my life, because I've realized that if you can inspire people, if you can find something really worth doing, and then you can get people around you, that enthusiasm is infectious and it brings people along with you. And it gives, of course, them opportunities, like Graham Clark gave me opportunities. But there was more to it than that, I guess, and that was that by the time I'd done a Bachelor of Medical Science, I thought, well, Graham's actually doing pretty well, isn't he? So maybe I'll do a PhD one day. That's what I thought. I have a third brush with history. It's really totally irrelevant, but I just thought I'd throw it in because not many people have brushes with history. I might put up a picture of a celeb or two. I have met one or two, but this was really interesting. This was during my this was during my kind of medical school. We used to go out and we sent out for a couple of months from the University of Melbourne to explore the world. So I decided to go to the Torres Strait, which is the first time, of course, I really met Indigenous people and worked with them. And I spent a week on this island after I'd done my time at the hospital. And this family just sat me down and said, what do you know about land rights? On their porch. And I was a young medical student trying to cram stuff in my head, more facts than I possibly could ever fit, and wasn't doing very good at that. I wasn't really a great student. But I realised years later that these were the Marbos. It was the Marbo family, and I was sitting on their porch. And they just said, what do you know about land rights, of which I knew nothing. But that conversation stayed with me too. Anyway, back to the main story. Although I must say Indigenous health comes back in this one. So I did eventually do that PhD. And for better or for worse, I thought, well, that Graham Clark, I'll probably get money from the HMRC to do my PhD if I do it with him because he's doing really well. But then I had 4 years of doing hearing. research as, on top of a medical degree. But one of the decisions I think I made there, and it was curiosity driven, but I think it's really important as you develop your career, and that was I wanted to know everything about the cochlear implant. A lot of the time we are trained in one little field, so the clinicians worry about the clinical bits and the scientists worry about the scientist bits, but Graham Clark worried about everything. And the question that I was directed into was actually basic neurophysiology. And essentially, I wanted to know how the cochlear implant sent neural codes into the brain and how those neural codes made people hear. Because at the time, that was the core of getting this device better. And it meant that I had to learn about physiology, about the anatomy, of course, about perception, but it actually really is why I've been successful. I've been successful because I was surrounded by people who could mentor the interest of a very, very broad understanding of my topic. I can explain to anyone who's interested in listening just about everything about a cochlear implant, from the surgery right through to what's happening in the brain, and how, and my career has been how to make all that better, right? But it's the breadth, I think. It's avoiding just getting, early in your career at least, really, really good at your silo, which is what you've been trained in, which is absolutely critical to success. Because, I mean, in the last talk, we were hearing about having to learn genomics. I'm struggling with genomics. I really have people around me who are very good at it, but I'm always thinking about how we can use it, right? And if you don't have that broad understanding, you'll rapidly get left behind. And you may become an excellent clinician or a really good reductionist scientist, but that's not how you change the world. And I'm surrounded here in this picture, I'm the little one in the middle, by Graham Clark, the great surgeon, but also scientist. And on the other side is Rob Shepherd, my other supervisor, who is a neurophysiologist. And here I am in the middle as what I hope to become as a surgeon scientist, and that indeed is what happened. So what happened after that? Well, I'd done medical school. In fact, I did my PhD fairly early, and I just want to talk a bit about that because there's lots of pros and cons. I'll be honest with you, I did it fairly early because I wasn't very happy as a young doctor, right? This was the 80 to 100 hours a week kind of thing, no social life, lose a girlfriend, all of that. It was pretty traumatic. People are looked after better these days. I don't think they're looked after well, but they're looked after better. There's no doubt about that. And the day I fell asleep on the Westgate Bridge coming home, I was lucky. I woke up before anything happened. This is the kind of life that we had to lead at that time. But anyway, I wasn't happy, so I did the PhD. It was serendipity that I met Graham Clark. And it was serendipity that I went back to him to do the PhD. But then I had a problem. I was being pushed. My life was being pushed into ENT surgery. I didn't think I wanted to become a surgeon. That was a problem. Well, it wasn't really a problem, but it was certainly unexpected. Serendipity, you might say, had pushed the direction of my interest, and the clinical interest, you might say, followed. So I had the opportunity to do a postdoc in Oxford. And if you get the chance to go to these kinds of places, just do it. Don't think about it, just do it. They are inspiring places. These places, you walk along, you feel the history. There's ideas around you. And it's not just about ideas. It's not about your work. It's not just about the brilliant people you meet in your work. It's the whole cultural side. My wife and I used to go down to London 2 or 3 times a week, and we just go to the opera, the Barbican, Festival Hall, the proms. We were just immersed in a broader culture than we could ever have hoped to have in Melbourne at the time. And so it is a really important part of this understanding the global community. And it is a privilege and an opportunity that comes to you from this life of being a surgeon scientist. So I strongly recommend, if you get a chance to go to any of the great places in the world, just do it. We did it on very little money. My scholarship was pittance, but we stayed in the UK for 4 years, as it turns out. And I'm very happy to say that the first surgical experience I had, which was when the die was cast, I really had to like ENT surgeon, but I happened to love it. So then I was in love with the surgery, which was really fortunate, because otherwise I think I would have been in a bit of trouble. You know, I have this analogy in my mind that I was at Oxford and there were these people around me in, you know, the University Laboratory of Physiology. Again, I was working on the physiology, the basis of the discipline. And I said to people fairly early on, it was pretty clear to me within a couple of months, I really need to do surgery. And they looked at me as if I was mad and said, "You're at Oxford. Are you going to really derail your whole career to become a clinician? You know, you'll never recover from this," was literally what people were saying. And it was almost like you were on an ocean liner and you were trying to turn its direction 90 degrees. It's cruising along with this great inertia, and to move it off the path took courage, because some very eminent people around me were saying, just don't do it. So you have to follow your heart. But I think if you've been trained as a clinician, you know that the best will come out if you combine both a deep fundamental knowledge and also follow your heart in terms of your motivation. And in fact, it turned out to be all the right decisions, and then everything happened as it should, inverted commas. I was lucky, you know, I mean, I see people following their hearts these days. It is harder now because a PhD is often just seen as a way of getting onto surgical training. And some people do it for the wrong reasons. Many people do it for the right reasons. Everyone learns a lot and everyone is better for the experience, but it doesn't kind of work as a tactic anymore. But for me, it wasn't a tactic. It was actually it was a motivation, right? Something I really, really wanted to do, because I really wanted to understand hearing. And then fortunately, I loved becoming a surgeon as well. So I ended up here, from Melbourne back to Sydney, which is actually my home, if the truth be known. I remember bands playing underneath that bridge from pontoons in Sydney Harbour, and you're a 13 or 14-year-old child listening to AC/DC and these kinds of bands. It was great fun. But anyway, I was back there and surgical training happened. But what happens after that? So now I've got a PhD, I'm trained as a surgeon, and what do you do? Well, this was really where the big first decisions came. I wanted to go overseas, everyone did at the time, but I was really lucky because of the scientific connections. I ended up working in Utrecht, where I had a job that was 50% in the operating theatre, which is what every young surgeon wants, and 50% in the laboratories, where I learned other aspects. In fact, aspects I've used extensively now for the last, well, at least over the last 5 to 10 years, some of the best work I've done, I learned the basics of that in those laboratories. But I wouldn't have had that opportunity if it hadn't been for the science first. Because the kinds of people that Graham Clark mixed with, and you know, he kind of introduced me to what my mentor in the Netherlands, was because of the science. That's why the connections were made. So, and from there, well, this was really what I asked myself, and this became a very pertinent question about 4 years later. I'd made a decision to give this surgeon scientist thing a go, and I'd had 2 days a week of dedicated time to do science, and I was trying to battle with everyone else to be recognised as a surgeon. And as a surgeon, you can't just work 1 day a week. You have to operate. As a surgeon, it's at least 50% to 60% you're going to be doing clinical work. Otherwise, your colleagues won't take you seriously. And so that is a battle for the surgeon. It really is. You just simply cannot go into the lab and do the 1 day a week clinical because you won't have the skills and you won't be respected. But I had a big question to ask, and that is, my mentor had invented the cochlear implant. So what does little me do, you know? What was there worth doing? And I had to think long and hard about this. I really did, because everyone wants to change the world when they're young, I think. I did. I hope every one of you do. And sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you've worked on one of the greatest achievements, I reckon Nobel Prize worthy of, time. And yet, what are you going to do to follow that? But what I've learned is that there's always a lot more to do. Okay, there's always great ways to make a difference. But these are the things I came up with. I really wanted to make the cochlear implant better. I thought I wanted to help out surgical training, and simulation technologies were just starting to come along. And I've wanted to make a contribution and a dedication to Indigenous health. So the rest of this talk really is about what those journeys have looked like. So the biggest problem with the cochlear implant to this day is the challenge people have hearing in the presence of background noise. It really is an issue. A cochlear implant is fantastic if you are just talking one-on-one. If you have about 3 or 4 people around you and they're all talking in turn, it's fine. But if you get a noisy situation, it really struggles. And people also, and the reason is fundamentally because what goes to the brain doesn't look right from the neural level, on the neural level. And that's why music appreciation isn't that good with the cochlear implant. And the reason is because really people with a cochlear implant don't hear pitch that well. So the first thing I did, and spent years and long nights with students in laboratories, often to midnight or later, doing single unit experiments on experimental animals, sticking tiny electrodes into their nerves, was to try to work out, well, how is it that people, what do animals sense? When they have a cochlear implant, what do the nerve responses look like, and can we change it? So what we did was, after about 5 or 6 years, we actually worked out what electrical stimulation did to nerve, which is basically jerk all the neurons at once, rather than have a nice, beautiful, fine kind of pattern of response. Every time you put a pulse in, all the nerves went jerk, and then you put another one in and all the nerves went jerk. And so we then we decided, only 15 minutes to go. Okay, I better move on. We decided to work out how to reverse that to make electrical stimulation that would make the nerves do what was looking much more natural to the brain. And then we implemented that with the CRC into a patient's, and it didn't work. So I thought, well, I better think of something else to do, hadn't I? The reasons why it didn't work became apparent later, and it's really fundamental to how electrical stimulation of nerve works at this particular point in time. But I learned an awful lot along the way, and it was good to try. But the next things that I did try has actually gone a long way, and that is to apply drugs to the inner ear so that there is less damage to the inner ear after implantation, that the inner ear might be repaired a little bit if it's, say, lost some nerves. And the thing that really worked were glucocorticosteroids. And these glucocorticosteroids are very good at reducing both fibrosis and also preserving inner ear function. And then a little bit later, and that's what you're seeing there, is the first human cochlear implant that was trialled in our department on the basis of the work that I'd started about 6 years earlier in the laboratory. It captured international attention. It captured the attention of Cochlear, the manufacturer of the Australian cochlear implant. And we've taken this even further now. So from 2006, doing experiments with students who are now surgeons, in other words, being the mentor, you might say, and giving them an opportunity. We are now in 2020 in regulatory clinical trials, meaning the kind of clinical trials of a device that will go into patients. And I've got a fundamental understanding of this from the bottom up because I did most of the fundamental work, and we are still working in laboratories to understand what we don't know about this. But I've had the privilege of actually being the world lead for the regulatory clinical trial that's going through the FDA. And it's no coincidence, okay? So that's one kind of translational journey of which I'm actually very proud, but it's been a great thing, you know, to take from the laboratory into people, and now I will one day be implanting these electrodes within the next few years. So what else can we do? And the other thing that's turned out to be really successful is the idea that people these days, when they have a cochlear implant, are often not entirely deaf. A lot of them have enough hearing that they value and they get information from. And we know that if you can keep that hearing and combine it with a cochlear implant, which is the hard thing to do and a particularly surgical thing to have to do, well, then these people actually hear better than if they have either the natural hearing or the cochlear implant. So instead of going from cochlear implant to hearing aid, well, then people, hearing aid to cochlear implant, people go to basically a cochlear implant with a hearing aid, which is what you see on that picture there. And so the technology exists for this kind of stuff, but the hard surgical question is how to do it. So we had this idea that when you put a cochlear implant in, what you're really putting in is a kind of a electrophysiology monitoring system, if you want to use it that way. These things have been used for years to monitor the nerve response in response to electrical stimulation. So we decided that we would try to make it into a response to measure the response of the inner ear to sound as you put the cochlear implant in. The idea is pretty basic, that if the cochlea stops listening to the implant as it goes in, maybe you've damaged the hearing. And so what we did was we worked out that you basically could crack cochlear's code of how the implant worked. You could then use one of those little electrodes inside the cochlea and use it not now as a stimulating device, but as a monitoring device. You could turn the device on as you implanted it, and you could send all the signals back, and you could do exactly the same things that I was doing as in the laboratories in Utrecht to work out what was coming from nerve cells, what was coming from hair cells, and you could work out whether the hearing had dropped. I want to draw your attention to the person who I gave this problem to, Luke Campbell. Now, Luke Campbell has subsequently won the Prime Minister's Prize for Innovation. He's actually the kind of foundation starter of neuro headphones now. He's found more excitement with headphones than with hearing. I still don't understand that. I honestly don't understand it, but hey, he's a different generation. However, it's one of the highlights of my career, giving people like Luke a good and difficult problem and then mentoring them through how we solve it. Because this has gone all the way through to now. What you're looking at now is this system working, and what you'll see in the top right corner there is the response of the inner ear. And what will happen as we go in, that response will get bigger and bigger if you watch in a minute, and that means we're getting closer and closer to where that response is coming from the inner ear. And then if that response starts to drop, we as surgeons know there's a problem. So this has been taken up by Cochlear. They've actually taken our software and they have put it into commercial research software that has EC and FDA approvals. And we now have a development grant with them to do what they can't do, to bring it into daily clinical practice. So in a few years' time, we'll be using this system that has gone all the way from animal experimentation rapidly through to humans. Within 5 years, has FDA approvals, and it'll be in every cochlear implant soon. And we've also done the clinical trials, which is my job as a surgeon, to show that we not only can you tell from the monitoring whether the hearing's been preserved, but you can actually, as a surgeon, manipulate what you do to save hearing. So we've done those trials. And so there's always a place for the surgeon scientist. Even when something's going commercial, there are things they can't prioritize, they can't do by themselves. And it's my job to do those things. But I better fly through the rest of this talk, I think. I really had. The other thing we've done is virtual surgical surgery, virtual surgical simulation. Again, because of the university links, we worked with CSIRO. They had this thing called the haptic workbench, which is basically a 3D haptic device, in other words, force feedback device. They didn't know what to do with it. We said to them, why don't you do a surgical simulator? And they said, yes. And so then we've actually had emulations of this. We've got into, it's a foot. This is basically how it works, to show you what it does. But the important thing for us is we've actually put AI into it. So now you can have surgical training. So here you have, and that's basically how you look with 3D goggles. And it's pretty close to how real surgery works. But the interesting thing is that you can use AI to no longer have to have someone training behind you. And for that, although someone tried to commercialize it, the company didn't work. That happens, but we've kept working and now have a course that every surgical trainee does based on all of the learnings from this through the College of Surgeons. And finally, Indigenous health. Indigenous health is really, oh, I'm just going the wrong way. Can I go backwards? It can go backwards. Yes, sorry. I really made a commitment to this early on, and again, through all the academic links, is how this was possible, you might say. Why are we interested in this as ENT surgeons? It's because a lot of Indigenous people don't hear very well, and they often don't hear very well when they're young children because they can get ear disease and a middle ear full of mucousy fluid before they're 12 months, often by the time they're 3 months of age, just the time when you try to learn to talk. And so these poor kids often don't hear again until their eardrums burst, when they hear a bit better, but still have a hearing loss then and for the rest of their lives unless it's fixed. Or they may not really start to hear until they're 7 or 8 or even older. Well, of course, a big problem, recognised as a big problem. But I thought, well, what can I do in Melbourne? Really, what can I do? Most of the problem is elsewhere in Australia, even though we do have responsibilities to local Indigenous people. Well, I can write. I can write grants, and I know how to get funding. So I kind of work with a team of people around the country, surgeons from around the country, and also some of my very good friends and colleagues from other disciplines to put together a large-scale clinical trial looking at whether any surgical interventions would be effective in treating otitis media. But then, of course, I had contacts after that, lots of contacts. And that has really meant that I've been able to then have influence to set up a clinic for ear health through my hospital. And we now are in partnership with the Victorian Aboriginal Health Service. We have the only ear health clinic in the state. It's been going for about 11 years, 11 years now. And it is considered a great success. The eye people have followed, so there's now an eye clinic there. And this is where you have this nexus of connection, of seeing a clinical need, and then that gives you opportunity to be able to influence people and things so that you can get things done that you otherwise could not. So, look, a couple of final reflections. One is about connection and the connections that you get through this life as a surgeon scientist. There's a young me with some of my older colleagues. What they all have in common is they're academics. They're all inspired by greater things in their own countries. And we've all been going, some of them have retired, well and truly, and there are younger people in their place, because this was 2002. We've now set up a training system in the largest public hospital in Bangkok that's been going for 20 years. And would have, of course, this year, except for COVID. So this is a sense of connection. And also you get to, and it's like-mindedness. and you meet people who think like you, but you have a global connection because these people are from all around the world. And also you get to meet people and join societies. This is a special society for ENT surgeons who have made significant contributions in science before the age of 50. And here you actually get nurtured by each other. I think it's fair to say it's really important. The friendships become what is the rock solid global stage upon which you find connection when things seem a bit tough. And this one I throw in because this is a little bit different. You might say, why am I showing Proud Mary, the coffee shop in Melbourne? Well, I want you to look at that little plaque there, which is the Foy and Gibson complex. Now, my chair is the William Gibson Chair of Otolaryngology. And it just happens that it was William Gibson's married into the family that donated that family married another family who then, through connections through the Idea Hospital, donated the money for my chair. So there's something about connection in your society that comes from the kinds of roles that people like me have. And I love going to Proud Mary. I say to them, I should be your honorary patron. You know, I have a chair of otolaryngology which has got your name on it, right, or the name of the building. But it is a wonderful thing about the life that you lead as a clinician-scientist. And the other reflection is coming back to silos, that it's really important early in your career to have a broad curiosity across the discipline you're interested in and not to fall into the trap of getting too much into just one area. You want to understand everything about it. I encourage you to think more like this person. Leonardo da Vinci, he could paint, he invented things. What a genius. But he thought outside the box. Not many of us can do what he did, but we can all build teams around us that can. And that's a really important thing to take home and a great joy part of this journey. And I just want to leave you, finally, you can read this, but these are the reflections of one of my patients. This is a poem that he wrote soon after he got a cochlear implant. And it's just a wonderful kind of summation of what has motivated me in my career. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you for that very inspiring talk. I suddenly want to change disciplines, but I don't think it's possible at this late stage. Because we're time constraints, we do actually have quite a few questions, but I'll just ask one or two. What advice would you have for medical students who want to pursue research during med school?
Well, some of the universities are gearing up to allow you to do a PhD as part of your medical school. If you can do that, that's great. But look, I think work with someone inspiring, if you can. I think that's really important. It's good to try to find someone or a project that's going somewhere as a medical student, because that'll inspire you and it'll give you the kind of inspiration that I had.
And just one more, because I think this is, having listened to you working until midnight, I got a bit worried. And this question is very relevant. How is your work-life balance? Have your priorities changed over time?
I must admit they have changed. I used to work 6 days a week. Now, that probably wasn't very sensible. But look, I guess there's several things I'd say. One is that I never do administration after hours. I hate administration. Between you and me, it's something that comes with the job, right? But I do what inspires me after hours. I do the things I love, which happens to be the kind of reading around a new topic, which happens to be, actually, I like working on papers. It might sound mad, but I do. I love looking at data. So I do stuff after hours that really interests me. So even though I work perhaps longer than I should, I'll make sure it's something that really is fun after hours. And I must say, I don't work Saturday and Sunday now.
Do you still do 50% surgical in the operating theatre?
Look, surgically, you've got to see patients as well. Yeah, but yes, I'm still doing 50% clinical.